Hello and welcome back to a review video. Today I'm going over the patch preview for 25.7. There are a bunch of changes here. Most of these have hit the PBE in the current form. They obviously can sometimes change before they go live, but I wanted to discuss the implications of some of these changes and how they affect the game as a whole. So the brand change is not a revert because this was actually a line of text they added in a couple patches ago, a while ago in 14.17. It's one of the big kind of downfall things of Brand Jungle. They capped the ablaze damage per second at 30 on jungle monsters, combined with the explosion that are now dealing a maximum set of damage to monsters. This was very meaningful. Brand Jungle kind of faded out ever since then. They are doing a walkback of this. This is now 40 instead of 30, and this is now 270 to 525 instead of 250 to 475. Do I think this suddenly revives Brand Jungle? Probably not. It was never a hugely popular thing in solo queue. In competitive, they might see this and start picking him up again, but there's a chance he just needs more than this. I would still think Brand Jungle will probably be on the weak side and is probably not a champion worth considering. The Ivan changes, though, are very big. This is his second max ability, so you're getting access to another 0.4 second root duration is huge. This is massive, primarily for competitive more than anything. Early game skewed buffs traditionally are always stronger in that kind of environment. Plus, it's hard CC. This is very valuable. There's a chance Ivan shoots up as like one of the number 1/2 junglers in competitive. For solo queue, Ivan's been underperforming for a while. This pick does tend to require some level of skill. He's also relatively unpopular. This might encourage people to start playing Ivan. I think the champion can be really good if you play it really well. If you play it poorly, though, and you don't optimize for clear, it can feel quite lackluster, and obviously you have less agency than most other junglers, so that is always something to consider when playing the champion. Olaf receives some very nice quality of life changes here. This is really good for weaving in ease with your auto attacks. That was always an issue that once you got to a really high attack speed as Olaf, that his E would be a detriment to him because you are losing out on auto attack damage. Obviously it is still a lot of damage, so it is nice to have, and being able to cast it quicker and then go back to autoing, maintaining ult or maintaining just DPS output, really huge for Olaf. This is a very big change. Definitely helps him scale even better into the game and helps him with certain enchanter pairing, so something to watch here. Olaf, I would say, is already in a very solid spot at the moment, especially into specific compositions and matchups. This does really help him in those spots. Shaco is getting a buff to his AD build. Obviously, AP Shaco is doing pretty well at the moment, so you want to avoid tagging that. Buffing up his bonus AD ratios really helps some of his lethality iterations. This doesn't... I mean, AD Shaco's always been a very snowball early game reliant advantageous pick, and has very much predicated on people just not really appreciating his strengths and his early game gank potential. I think this does help him. Obviously, if you can secure kills early and then snowball that into a greater advantage, he now spikes harder with items even more so. Should be good. I do think Shaco is a very good solo queue pick. Shouldn't really pop up in competitive. I don't think this is going to be enough to really push him in that direction. The Shen changes, this is really nice. Really helps with his tower sieging. This I actually wrote down. This is something I grabbed. It's 10 to 40 damage on the passive. On the Q passive technically. Really nice amount of damage to gain on towers. If you're hitting a tower for say 40-50 damage, gaining another 10 on there, it's really nice. It really helps getting when you get access to wave clear, like your Sunfires, your Hollow Radiances, your Titanic Hydras. If you're able to push the wave and then siege a bit better, yeah, really big for him. He does traditionally get tower hits in early on the game. He is very strong in isolated 1v1 and can, if he ever kills the opponent. Now siege, possibly get a plate or two depending on what stage of the game it is at. Yeah, should be nice. I think Shen is struggling at the moment. This pick traditionally tends to be a decent amount better, but has kind of fallen with the tank items being relatively nerfed, and is kind of using a Dead Man's Plate as a way of standing up at the moment, but this should definitely help him. Trundle. So Trundle E slow is going from 30 to 46% to 34 to 50%, and the cooldown is going from 24 to 16 to 21 to 15. This is really big for Trundle support. This is almost guaranteed a Trundle support skewed buff. This was originally one of the reasons they nerfed it back along. The slow got increased from 20 to 60 to 32 to 60, and then they ended up nerfing it down because it was too strong, and players in the support role were abusing it, playing it into, I think it was like 80 champs at the time, maybe, or just like your Leonas and stuff. I can't specifically remember why it was popping up a lot, but into like certain melee matchups, I think more than anything, he was performing really well, and yeah, that was one of the ways they nerfed it and kind of kept it in check. Do I think Trundle support is going to make a big comeback? Probably not, but I imagine it has some level of viability now as like a flex pick. This is also very nice for Trundle jungle, having another 4% slow tapped on like early levels, really big for like his ganking, and yeah, definitely does help him. Trundle top also does benefit from this, so overall Trundle, yeah, receiving a really nice buff, could honestly be enough to push him as like an idea in competitive. It is like getting early game power is always the main thing to look at there. Volibear, this is kind of sad. It's not enough. There are 3 items which I would say are like worth watching when it comes to AD Volibear. That is Sundered Sky, Steric, maybe Shojin to an extent, and those are like the main 3 I have on the top of my head. There might be like one other. This isn't going to be enough. Sundered Sky does quite heavily underperforming to some of his like AP options at the moment. Like Cosmic Drive Rush is by far and away the best way to play him in the jungle at the moment. There needs to be more here to really encourage. Like, I think they could have gone all the way to like 0.25% bonus AD on the W, and even then that might not have been enough. So it's unfortunate. It does promote the idea of AD Volibear though, so you can play it. It's not like it's unplayable at the moment. It is just substantially weaker, and this doesn't really do enough to close the gap, in my opinion. Honestly, I think Volibear's jungle should probably be playing AD, so yeah, I would have rather they gone a bit harder here. The other thing was, which I wanted to mention, is both Steric and Sundered Sky scale with base AD, and Volibear has really low base AD. That's always been one of the prioritations of the champion, primarily because of the power of the passive, giving him like flat on hit damage, which is why they have to keep his base AD low. It's unfortunate, but that's kind of where he's at the moment. The Darius nerfs, now this is interesting. I actually was thinking they would do something like this, like previous patch. I was like, but Darius is actually really strong in top and jungle at the moment. Wouldn't be surprised if they went after the jungle modifier and some flat power on Darius. They went after the jungle modifier. They went after flat power in the next patch. This is a pretty big nerf. Darius losing 2 base armor, really big for like his early trading, especially against like AD champions. And the E cooldown does mean it's more punishing if you miss this ability. There were a couple of changes back along to apprehend, to kind of balancing him at one point. Can't remember if this was specifically around the time where Stridebreaker had its dash. I think this was like actually a while after, but there were string of changes here. There was also like Trifold Trinity back then, so there was a lot of like different power things which went into Darius, but this losing 2 seconds on early ECD does make it more punishing. If you track the cooldown, then you have a lot more window to play, especially if he just misses the ability. Gwen is receiving a follow-up nerf. Makes sense. Gwen is still very strong, even after the hotfix nerf. The Q is losing a flat 10 damage, pretty big, and the W is losing 3 flat resist, but gaining it through 2% AP ratio. This will actually scale better now, especially if you get access to, I mean, like 100... 200, 300 AP. This will be a pretty sizable amount of resist increase, especially going later on into the game. But the main thing here, the Q losing some damage, is pretty meaningful. I still think Gwen will be a really solid champion in the right spots, just probably not as blindable as she is at the moment. Lilia is receiving a partial revert on the buff she received. The buff was cooldown reduced from 14 to 12, and the AP ratio increased from 50 to 60%. The the nerf here is obviously the AP ratio change. The E cooldown's still in. It's still meaningful. They did overswing, so I'm glad they are slightly walking it back. And yeah, Lilia going to be slightly tapped down. Lulu is receiving a pretty sizable nerf. Losing 10 flat damage off Q is very meaningful early on. You traditionally max this ability last when you're playing Lulu support. Sometimes you like see it get max first or second, or like some alternating points if you're playing lane Lulu. That is still going to be meaningful here. The W cooldown is going from 18 to 60 seconds to 18 flat. This is also going to hurt the incentive of maxing W. These are all meaningful Lulu changes. I think Lulu will definitely be a lot weaker going into next patch. Will still be played in like her certain pairings, like the Cogmore for example, but as like the number one premier enchanter pick, she already was kind of losing that spot, but this should definitely seal the deal and like bring her down to more like a possibly even B tier pick. In the case of Neferi, she is once again also receiving some follow-up changes. They overswung. Neferi jungler is currently the strongest jungler in the game at the moment. Neferi solo lane still doing decently fine. Our armor is going from 30 to 28. This is going to be more of a... I mean, it's going to affect both mid and jungle. Same goes for HP. These are going to affect, like, the Yone Yasuo matchups for early. The WCD, going to be meaningful. Specific. This one's more jungle skewed, if anything, where you are using the ability of cooldown to gain that AD, to gain the damage amp. And the passive monster mod is going down as well, so going to clear even slower. The Q minion mod, however, is going up, so helps her wave clear generally. The Fury, yeah, will be weaker going into next patch, but still should be relatively strong compared to where she is at the moment. Singed is going to receive some follow-up adjustments. They overswung, I believe. That's for like their thought pattern with this. The changes were very low elo skewed that Singed received. I didn't grab them here, but basically what Singed received was his oh my god, it's a disaster. Basically what Singed received was a oh, they're not actually written down here. Oh no, it's here. So yeah, what Singed received was a change to his change to his poison trail. Now grants Singed minion kill credit if an affected minion would die to a minion damage within the time before the next damage instant. Really low elo skewed buff here. This like helps people who weren't as effectively like proxying or like clearing with his Q on the wave. They did some compensation nerfs to kind of make up for the fact that this would be a decent amount of power to gain. They took away some of his health growth, took away some of the AP ratio on Fling. They also did a hotfix, which I was not aware of, where the AP ratio per tick was reduced to 10% from 10.625% AP. So that is also a meaningful amount of power loss. That was 6 days ago. So that was about when the patch went, like a little bit after the patch went live. They are following up with Q per second ratio going from 40% to 42.5%, so that is going to be some power given back. The passive, however, is going to be weaker, and the R stats is also going to be weaker, so Singed probably will end up being relatively neutral to where he is at the moment. I think for Q is obviously where a lot of his damage lies, so losing some power elsewhere, gaining it through Q, should, yeah, about even things out. Now, the Xerath changes, these confuse me, because I think this isn't the right what they wanted to do was, like, make some mid-skewed Xerath changes. What they've done here is they've given him a bunch of AP ratios, like buffs, but took away some of his base damage, which doesn't make a huge amount of sense, because what you traditionally see is base damage buffs are more, or like level scaling buffs, power are mid lane skewed because you get access to more levels, so taking away, for example, 10 flat E damage is meaningful for the power of mid lane Xerath. Same goes for the W. The Q didn't get any, like, the Q is just strictly buffed. The R is also, like, losing 10 flat damage. I think in the long run, these are just buffs, like gaining 5% here, 5% on the W, 5% on the Q, 5% on the ultimate, are all very meaningful, and getting access to more gold is really important for Xerath. Like, looking at Rabadon now, it should be a very important item on him. Obviously, Ludens is in a pretty rough spot at the moment. I'd love to have seen some sort of Ludens buff here. Obviously, there isn't one. But yeah, I think this is the wrong way to go out of things. I think this will very much benefit. I think if this is like ends up being a strict buff, or like a buff generalistically to Xerath, this will also be a huge buff to Xerath support, and Xerath is definitely a champion worth watching going into next patch. Yone. So Yone's passive crit modifier is going from 90% to 100%. This is really, really big. We've already seen the impact this had on Yasuo. However, the E no longer cleanses crowd control at the end of the effect. We saw a lot of, I saw a lot of discussion about this on Twitter. The, obviously, it's technically skill expression down. Does meaningfully affect people in disproportionately in higher MMRs. They will more effectively make use of this change. For Yone's for average player, this is just going to be almost entirely a buff. This is really good for him. Yone actually does underperform for average elos. This might surprise a lot of people because I know he is considered a very frustrating champion. But yeah, he doesn't perform as well for the average player. This should definitely help him, especially if he's going more towards the shield bow, the infinity edge builds. Maybe he picks up a Yun Towers. However, that still seems to be relatively underperformant for Yasuo and Yone, but it is definitely something to watch. This should definitely help him a lot. The Yorick changes, so there is a huge amount of text here. I would really recommend watching the Freak video. He goes into depth about the overall impact and goal of what these changes are. Basically, I believe they are trying to go after consistency and more than anything on Yorick. They are going to obviously have to take away some power on him, but they want more goal and more ghouls, make it so it's a bit more consistent getting these ghouls, and just make them a bit more a bit better in terms of how they function. Basically just trying to increase the fun factor, I guess, for the Yorick player. To make it so it's not as frustrating when certain things happen with Yorick, the Mist Walkers no longer recall with Yorick when engaged in the jungle monsters. That's a very nice quality of life change to receive. Overall, it'll probably just have to be a case of waiting and seeing what kind of impact this has going into the game when this goes live. Hopefully, the Yorick mains are happy with these changes, and hopefully they land in a good spot. The system buffs then. So, Catalyst is being buffed. This is very nice. Catalyst is a pretty rough item to build. It's unfortunate that Catalyst only builds into one item at the moment. I kind of miss the fact that Catalyst doesn't build into Abyssal anymore. I think current Abyssal is in a pretty rough spot in terms of its shape. You only really want it in very specific scenarios, and the old Abyssal felt a lot more accessible as an item in different spots. Obviously, it created certain things mid lane Nautilus, which I think were cool for the time. But yeah, I can see some concerns around that. That being said, though, Catalyst obviously only builds into Roa at the moment, giving it one more Ruby Crystal, giving it a bit more mana, giving it a bit more power in the Eternity passive. All very nice. Should definitely make it a lot nicer to have and pick up as an item, especially because it has a pretty steep cost. In the case of World of Ages, it is also being buffed. This is a really nice change for Roa. Really helps a lot of the champions which build that, but stuff your Cassidins, I've seen Ari's and Oriana's build it recently. Obviously that shouldn't be one of their core items. They should be looking at something like Ludens or Malignance in the case of Ari, but I know Ludens is in a really bad spot at the moment, so it's once again quite unfortunate that there is no system buff to Ludens, that alongside some of the other other items which could do with being buffed. But Roa, yeah, definitely has room to gain. Don't think it's quite as bad as a lot of people perceive it as being, but I can see the concerns with the item, especially when the build path was quite as egregious as it was. In the case of Umbreglaive, it is going down by 100 gold in cost. It is gaining 5 AD, but the passive cooldown is going from 50 seconds to 90 seconds. This is actually probably not as meaningful for most as it's meaningful because there's two ways of looking at it. You're losing control of vision, or you're not able to clear vision as consistently, and you're also not going to get some level of gold back through that vision. That is meaningful. Killing wards, gaining the plus 30 or the plus 10 gold does have value, and losing some of that power through the passive is going to be meaningful. That obviously will come back through the cost. The main thing here is the 5 AD being gained. That's also very nice. I don't think Umbreglaive is ever going to be in a spot where it can be good and not really overbearing on someone like Pyke or Senna, for example. Obviously Senna has had her kit shifted quite aggressively, so it's not going to be as much of a core item on her. But Umbreglaive is basically just a Pyke item. You don't really see it outside of that unless you're playing maybe an ADC in the support role. but even then, it still has issues. Amber Glaive is kind of just a flawed item in how it functions, but this should be nice for the likes of Pyke if he does want to pick it up early on the game. Two more changes here are the system nerfs. So the Fountain and Home Guard, the max HP per second is going from 10.4 to 8%. The max HP per second, max mana per second is going from 12.4% to 10%. So meaningfully, you are gaining less HP, less mana. You are not going to be able to leave the Fountain as quickly. Like, you're going to have to wait a bit longer. The missing HP and mana per second, however, is going from 6 to 12% to 16% always. So this is actually going to have some level of compensation here. Like, actually, you'll probably be about the same with these with this change here. And with the Home Guard, decaying movement speed is going from 75 to 150 to 65 to 150. 10% of the movement speed is meaningful. This is going to overall be a nerf. You're going to be out on the map not as quickly. Yeah, that is going to be a meaningful change and make laning phase more important. That is like the main takeaway with a change like this. And then lane swap detection. I still kind of want to know what they're like doing under the hood, whether they've actually got a plan to kind of address it, or whether they're just going to keep doing these like minute changes to try and make it less intruding on like the average player game, whilst also making sure it doesn't like pop back up in competitive. They've shrunk it to no longer include Raptor Camp. That's a relatively nice change. I don't think this has a huge amount of impact. Maybe I imagine it's like 0.1% of games are like affected by this, but yeah, I mean, it's nice if you were being affected by this because of a certain strategy. You should no longer be affected by it. Overall, it's a small patch. I would have loved to have seen a lot more changes. I think there are some pretty core like big issues to like certain roles and itemization at the moment. Just taking like a random example, I think opportunity is in a pretty bad spot at the moment. You could mention a number of the tank items which I think are like too niche or not in a great spot. There's just a lot of items which don't really feel like they either have a huge place in the game at the moment, and a lot of the builds feel like they're very locked to what the just like a certain 5 items, because certain items just don't feel that good. Things like Luna's Companion, another one which I think could really do with being rebuffed in its current state. This was my thoughts, so thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.